Welcome to Oxford Road Presents The Divided States of Media. I'm Dan Granger. We recorded this one last week, and it's one of my favorite episodes so far. We're talking to journalist and podcaster Katie Herzog. Katie is ridiculously witty and knowledgeable, but also she is so authentic and truly walking the walk when it comes to intellectual honesty as a media professional, something that we are finding is increasingly rare these days. About halfway through the podcast, you'll hear a surprise interruption that I believe actually demonstrated the real cure for the polarization that threatens us. Let's dive in. You'll see what I mean. Our guest today is Katie Herzog, who is, if nothing, humble and a minimalist in her bio. Usually I do these really long, in-depth bios, but what I'm going to tell you about Katie is that she is a writer, and she's the host of the podcast Blocked and Reported. She also lives outside of Seattle, so we did get that tidbit. But, the reason I wanted to have Katie on, I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion. She's somebody who is, not only witty and smart in her writing and communication, but also very, very authentic and intellectually honest, which I think is something we're all craving right now. So Katie, welcome to the show. So much that I want to get into here. But first things first, can you just give us a little bit of backstory on your professional journey?
Sure. My podcast. So right now I'm just a podcaster. I say I'm a writer and a podcaster, but really I haven't written anything since I started the podcast because it turns out
here and there, right?
What was that?
You tweet.
I do tweet. I guess that counts. I write grocery lists and I tweet.
There you go.
So I started the podcast. It's called Blocked and Reported in, I think, March or April, along with Jesse Single, who's a journalist on the East Coast. And before that, we started the podcast essentially because I was laid off from my job. So I was a staff writer at The Stranger, which is Seattle's alt weekly. And I was one of, a lot of COVID layoffs, which, at the time seemed terrible. But it turns out it was maybe the greatest thing that has ever happened to me. Because we started this podcast and it's been very successful, and I'm now making significantly more money than I was as a writer, and I only have to work one day a week and I don't have to leave my house. So I still identify as a writer, but I'm not sure that I actually am one anymore.
Well, it's still in you. And how do you find that the work of, if we call it journalism, how does it change from what you were doing professionally before to what you're doing as a podcaster? Like just content-wise, substance approach, all that.
The big difference is freedom. So right now in media, there's a lot of what I call the pressure to conform. So I worked at a very liberal leftist paper. The Stranger has been around for 30 years. It was founded by the guy who founded The Onion. So it has a very sort of quintessential alt weekly tone. Mm-hmm. Not that alt weeklies really exist anymore, but The Stranger was it really for a long time. In the last few years, however, there was a real shift in terms of audience reception and sort of internal communications about what is and what is not acceptable to talk about. And so the message that I received, mostly from feedback from readers who would call my bosses and email me incensed, and from my colleagues, was that there are certain things that I wasn't allowed to say. And I don't have to deal with that anymore. I'm totally free because I'm not dependent on a paycheck from anybody else. Our podcast is funded totally through Patreon. So we don't have corporate sponsors yet. We're hopefully that will change at some point, but our funders are all fans of the show. And unless I somehow manage to piss off all 3,000 of them at the same time, or something, there's, let's say, a global pandemic that crashes the market and everybody is broke, then I don't have to worry about those sort of external pressures to think and act and write a certain way.
Yeah, well, as a byproduct of this, I think that we'll want to have that sponsorship conversation with you.
Sure.
But listen, I think that your experience is probably representative of what a lot of journalists are experiencing, right? And so what are some of the, unannounced rules of conformity that you, like, what can't you say?
Yeah. So I'll give you a little bit of my backstory, and I think that'll explain it really well. So, so I used to write about climate change, and, for a progressive magazine, and I would get hate mail every once in a while, and it was typically from people who don't believe in climate change deniers, something like that. none of it really mattered because it didn't have any impact on the site or on me or sort of emotionally. And then I got laid off from that job and I started freelancing for The Stranger. And one of my first really big pieces for the paper was a feature called The Detransitioners. And it was about a group of people who transitioned from one sex to the other or gender to the other and then transitioned back. And it was a deeply reported piece. It was not an opinion piece. It was just about this phenomenon, about a small but growing population. And it was about what happened to these people. And what happened to them basically was that they got kicked out of their social networks, got sort of ostracized from the communities that they'd been in. And I was interested in this. And so I read about it. And there was a crazy backlash to the piece and no demands for corrections or anything like that because the piece was thoroughly fact-checked. We even had trans sensitivity readers. And I made sure to get the voices of happily transitioned people in the piece. It really was not a polemic. It was not anti-trans. It was not anti-transition at all. It argued in favor of trans people accessing healthcare. But there was a crazy, crazy backlash. And a lot of that was online, as you would expect, sort of the Twitter pylon that we see every day.
Yeah.
But it was offline as well. So there were flyers up in my neighborhood calling me transphobic. People made stickers calling, over the years, there have been, I think, 4 different sticker campaigns. So I would walk down the street in Seattle and see a picture of my face, somebody calling, with Nazi, friend of Nazis on the sticker, which is a very strange experience to go through, especially when you are not actually a Nazi or transphobic or anything like that. The most embarrassing sticker, I think, actually said Jordan Peterson apologist. That one was hard to explain to people. So there were those sort of external pressures from outside the organization, and that had an impact within the organization, because even if my editors thought that my work was good, I had coworkers who didn't, who thought that I was a literal Nazi, and they would complain. And if you're the publisher or the editor, and you have employees coming to you and saying this person is a problem, this person is problematic, it becomes an HR issue, right? So ideas all of a sudden become an HR issue. I had a colleague at one point complain to my boss about something I had written. And my boss has told this woman who's young, just out of college, her first writing job. They said, if you have a problem with something that Katie wrote, you can write about it yourself. You can respond on the website. You can respond on the blog, which is what, 15 years ago on at The Stranger, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, there was this, even 5 years ago, there was this like robust conversation between writers. So just as an example, Dan Savage was the creative director for the paper, longtime writer for the paper. And he got in sort of a tiff with another esteemed writer, Lindy West, when she was on staff there, because he wrote something that she thought was fat phobic. So Lindy wrote a response to this. This post ended up going viral. It got turned into a story on This American Life. It got turned into a book, and then it got turned into a TV show, right? So because of this fight between Dan and Lindy has a TV show on Hulu. So this was I'm guessing this is probably 7 or 8 years ago. Fast forward to 2020, a colleague of mine has a problem with something I've written, but instead of responding to it in writing, instead of making the argument, she goes to the boss and says her community is demanding that she quit because I'm still employed by the paper. So that's how things have changed in the past 8 years. There's no discussion, there's no argument, and there's just HR complaints, essentially. So I will say I'm very glad not to be in any sort of institution now, because I only have to work with one person. And if he wants to complain to HR, well, I'm HR. So yeah. This complaint won't get far.
Which I'm happy that it's working for you, but it's a sad state of affairs, right? I mean, when you think about like the bell curve of just American views on issues, you've always had extremes on both sides, always, right? Do you feel like the extremes are actually larger, or are they just louder and more influential?
I think both, probably. I wouldn't know how to quantify it, but I think what you're seeing is, especially in media, there's this sort of accepted narrative on the left, and deviating from that. And this is also true in academia and tech and other sort of white collar industries. And deviating from that comes with a real cost, or it can come with a real cost, because people have been fired from their jobs for, tweeting the wrong thing or something like that. And that has a real stifling effect on everybody else. And I'm not talking about actual problematic or extremist views. I'm talking about anodyne, mainstream, moderate views that don't fit in with this current narrative. And so I think that, I think Twitter is really the problem, at least when it comes to media, because Twitter is not, I think 20% of the American public is on Twitter. So it's actually small compared to Facebook and Instagram and sites like that. And most people don't tweet, or they tweet rarely.
Right.
But the problem is that the people who are on Twitter wield enormous influence in the culture. And that's people in media, it's people in politics, it's people in entertainment. And so those voices, at the tail end, they're at the ends of the bell curve, and they do have I don't think they typically reflect the views of the American populace, but they do influence the views of the American populace, because you see them reflected in the New York Times, or you see them elevated in places like the New York Times, or Washington Post, or any major media outlet, or minor media outlet for that matter.
Well, and I don't want to speak on your behalf, but from what I have heard and listened to, I mean, you do identify as a Democrat, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a registered Democrat.
Yeah.
I will be voting for Joe Biden in November.
So what is that like when you feel like people on the same side of the aisle politically make it unsafe for you to just have,
Right.
civil discourse and explore these things?
Oh, I mean, that's the whole thing. That's the point, is you can't, there's a lot of discussion about cancel culture right now.
Right.
Cancel culture can only emerge from your own side. You cannot be canceled by the other side. I have pissed off right-wingers my entire career. It has had no effect on my career. In fact, in some ways it's good. If you're pissing off the right, if you're leftist or a liberal and you're pissing off the right, that is taken as a sign that you're doing something correct. And nobody cares. Your boss isn't going to care if a bunch of people with, Pepe avatars in their Twitter bios are sending, angry tweets to the company Twitter account. They don't care, because that's not the market. That's not the audience.
So what's the harm? What is the actual harm, in addition to like, it's obvious what the harm is if you're the contributor who gets canceled, but what's the harm for society?
Oh, that's a great question. It depends on the field that you're in. But all right, let's take something like academia.
Yeah.
I hear from professors all the time, almost daily, who say, I can't publish in this field anymore. I can't study this thing anymore, because the conclusions that I might come to will be inconvenient to this narrative. So people are not doing research on things that should be studied because they're afraid of the backlash. The same thing is true of media. And let's just like look at the election right now.
Yeah.
For one thing, those of us in the media, and I'm sure that nobody else would like me representing them, but I'm going to for a moment represent
please.
the media. The media, for the most part, was completely flabbergasted by the election of Donald Trump in 2016. I was the exception to this. I actually thought that he was going to win, because I'm a pessimist.
Why did you think that? Yeah, because you're a pessimist.
Well, I thought he was going to win because I think I realized how much people hated Hillary Clinton in a way that was invisible to a lot of the left-leaning media, who saw this as a real feminist victory. But I would talk to people like my in-laws they're Christian, they cannot stand Donald Trump. They're real Christians, not sort of fake Christians, but they can't stand Donald Trump. They think he's a bad man.
Yeah.
They also think what they said was Hillary Clinton is a snake in the grass, quote unquote, snake in the grass. And when they said that, I thought, what has Hillary Clinton done to these people? Well, basically nothing. But Americans have hated Hillary Clinton since the 90s. And I think a lot of people sort of forgot that. She's always been a polarizing figure. And, so if you exist in this world, if like you spend all of your time in Twitter and these or within your own sort of social networks, online or offline, within your own media bubbles, you don't know what is happening in the world, and you get 2016, where everybody is shocked at the result, when I don't think people really should have been shocked. Or, take the primary. I don't think many people would have predicted that Joe Biden, despite the fact that Biden actually did fairly well in polling, I do not think many people in the media would have predicted that Joe Biden, I don't think anybody actually would have predicted that Joe Biden would be the Democratic nominee. But it's not just about making accurate predictions. It's about reflecting the world as it actually is. And the world as it actually is not Twitter. It is not your media bubble. It is not your echo chamber.
Yeah, well, it was interesting. I just drove across the country
Mm.
and saw all these different Americas, right? And one of the things that I had never seen before was Trump shops. Have you ever
Yeah.
seen a Trump shop?
Oh yeah.
There's
I live in,
Starbucks.
yeah, yeah.
Oh, you have Trump shops where you are?
Yeah, I live in outside Seattle, but I live in sort of a rural. I live in a Navy town, and I'm
Hmm.
surrounded by rural areas, and I have yet to see a single Biden sign. Not even one. I've seen more Joe Jorgensen signs than Biden
Yeah.
signs, but Trump is everywhere. Trump shops, Trump giant trucks with Trump flags. I mean, I don't think Trump will actually win my county, but if you judge by the flair, then
Right.
you know then Trump is going to dominate this election.
Well, and that's my observation is the passion is so deep,
Yes.
and people are so focused on surrounding themselves by like-minded viewpoints that they have no idea what's coming. They have an inability to anticipate that. And I think just as a citizen, I'm fearful for the reaction if and when he does win again.
Yeah.
How are people going to deal with that? Because they're not expecting it,
Right. Right.
right?
Right.
So when you think about the focus today is media, right? But we've been talking to a lot of different people, and and the deeper issue I think is polarization,
Yeah.
right? And I see great harm in it. I wonder, first, do you think that polarization in the way that we're getting it today, is that harmful for everyday citizens?
Yeah.
What do you see? Like, how does that affect people in their actual lives day to day?
I think it is. I think it is really harmful for people, and you see this all the time. You see people say, like, after Trump was elected, I had to defriend my entire family on Facebook. And it's become this sort of thing. Like this year will be the exception because I doubt there will be very many in-person Thanksgivings. But around Thanksgiving every year, there's sort of this wave of discussion about how you should interact with your Trump relatives as though they're not human or something like that.
Yeah.
So the way to interact with them is just the way that you interact with everybody else. I think there's one of the things that I think is harmful is that on the left, at least, sort of the in these purity circles and the left, there's this idea that if you and this is true in media as well, if you interact with the Trump supporter, if you're friends with the Trump supporter, that you have done some grievous moral wrong.
Right.
And I think that's really a problem. What we need more commingling of political views. Diversity is important, not just diversity in terms of ethnicity and gender and sex and all that, also diversity of thought. And part of that is because if you're surrounded by people who only think like you, then you end up with Evergreen State University or the Portland City Council, where you just have extremism. And people, I'm sure people at Evergreen don't see it as extremists, or people on the Portland Seattle Council don't see themselves as extremists. But if there's no one around you to check your ideas and to say, here's another perspective, then that's just sort of naturally what happens. And you see this on both the right and the left. So you have these, deep red districts with no Democrats in office, and they're naturally going to move to the margins of acceptable belief. And the same thing is true on the left.
So how did we get here? We've gotten perspectives that it's politics and it's gerrymandering, and you can't vote cross-party in a primary. We've heard that it's the education system and an uninformed electorate that's just eating media junk food. Some people say it starts in the home and how people interact with their family. What is your perspective on how we got here?
I think that's all probably true. I also think that social media and the internet is a really significant factor here.
Right.
Social media and the way media is set up right now, you can filter out everything you don't agree with.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a problem. So so your feeds are curated, or sort of the algorithm sort of pushes you in this increasingly narrow media bubble, right, where everybody agrees, and you have to really go out of your way to find opinions you don't agree with, which I think is the value of places like the New York Times publishing opinion pieces by people like Tom Cotton. Of course, when the New York Times did publish an opinion piece by Tom Cotton, one I totally disagreed with, by the way, there's a massive outcry. Heads roll. The head of the opinion section got ousted from his job. There was a rebellion within the building. The problem with that, even if you disagree with Tom Cotton, is that Tom Cotton's argument doesn't disappear just because the New York Times won't publish it. And so I think the value of places like the Times publishing contrary opinion pieces is that it forces the readers of the New York Times to grapple with the world that we actually live in and not the world as they want it to be. And we're seeing less of that now because there's such significant backlash from within these organizations that editors are scared of their own staffers. And so they're losing their guts. It's really remarkable to watch.
Yeah, well, and you know, we were talking offline. We see that on the brand side, where marketers who need to reach audiences, and you know, whatever you're selling, it's like, you know, Republicans buy sneakers too,
right?
But it's becoming less and less safe for people to sponsor different types of media because there's if then logic. Right. Where it's like, because you sponsored this program or this network or this personality, then you are co-signing all of their beliefs.
Right.
And, you know, so it's getting very, very dangerous. I mean, if you play this forward 5-10 years and we don't see any kind of reversal, what happens to America?
That's the question. I don't think we're going to face some sort of like actual civil war or anything like that.
That's possible?
No, because a civil war presupposes that there are, you know, armies, that you would have like a California army to fight like the Idaho army. I don't think that'll happen. I do think, you know, political violence is becoming more acceptable. So I'm concerned about that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot depends on the election. On if Trump wins, I think things are going to get much worse. Mm-hmm. In part because Trump winning, it's not just about his policies. I think the backlash to Trump winning a second term is going to just be enormous. So I'm deeply concerned about that. You know, I don't know where things are headed. I do think the media is going to change significantly. Right now, there's so many people like me who have left or been forced out of traditional media, and a lot of that is market forces, who are going independent. And while that's really good for me because I don't have a boss and I'm making more money and I work 1 day a week, from a consumer perspective, I think it's actually terrible. Or from a social perspective, I think it's actually terrible, because one of the problems are these echo chambers and these media bubbles. And if people stop reading the New York Times or stop subscribing to, you know, the Washington Post or whatever, and decide to support their favorite creators, that's great for the creator. But it also means that you're not going to get the divergent perspectives that you get if you just read a paper. Well, that you used to get when you read a paper. So I'm concerned about that. And also, like, I you know, podcasts are absolutely huge right now. Mm-hmm. People don't really hate listen to podcasts. They hate read, but they don't hate listen to podcasts. Mm-hmm. So I've been really surprised that the vast majority of the feedback my podcast has gotten has been positive. I thought there was going to be at least a couple of, you know, mini scandals by now. And we've gotten a little bit of pushback, but for the most part, we're only hearing from people who like us, which is good and bad.
You want a pessimistic view on that?
Yes.
So what I'm worried about is that it hasn't been a large enough force in media. I mean, they're just looking at getting it to $1 billion next year. There's a million different podcasts, right? Yeah. And the transcripts of each show are not readily available, so it's hard to search for language. Right. But when the watchdog groups that monitor traditional media turn their gaze to podcasts, now you're talking about an hour of spoken word conversation. I mean, think of the sound bites people could run against you to say, look what she said. Yeah,
and I think that is happening if you're a certain size. So I'm sure that Media Matters has somebody devoted to watching the Ben Shapiro show every day, or listening to the Ben Shapiro show every day, and maybe Rogan even.
Well, so I want to hear about that, because now you're really in our sweet spot, right? Is what do you think about watchdog groups like Media Matters, Sleeping Giants? Are they helping or are they harming? What is your position?
If Media Matters were helping, I think things would be better. Media Matters is not a new, I mean, how long have they been around? Like, 15, 20 years at least. Yeah. No, I do not think they're helping. I think they're making things much worse. In part because there's also this, places like Media Matters do have that sort of cancel culture impulse.
Right.
And they don't do,
that's the
yeah.
purpose, right? Is to
That's
get
the
them,
purpose. That's
right?
the purpose.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think that's helpful in media. I think, I don't know. I'm not a fan of the organization. I'll put it that. And they also don't do, like, I've tried to use Media Matters to do things like give me data on like, when I was working on the detransition piece, actually, I tried to get Media Matters to help me do some, or I was not even help me do. I was trying to see if they had done any sort of analysis on how trans stories had been covered in the news over the past like 5 years. They don't do stuff like that. All they do is watch Fox News and attack Fox News.
Right. Yeah.
If
it was equal opportunity on both sides, that would be different. Are there any watchdog groups that you're familiar with that are actually trying to promote journalistic integrity? And is journalistic integrity dead?
Good question. I don't know of any groups that are specifically trying to promote journalistic integrity. You know, that used to be a public editor's job, but most places got rid of their public editor. The New York Times, you know, famously fired their public editor, laid off, I don't know, got rid of the public editor and said, we don't, you know, Twitter is the public editor, which is, Twitter should not be the public editor at all. And the second part of your question was, is integrity dead?
Journalistic integrity dead. Does it even have a place anymore?
Yeah, it has to have a place. That said, did it ever exist in the first place?
I think there were at least attempts.
I think that there were.
I mean, we had laws to try to enforce some of that, right? At least for a period of time, right?
Right.
And, you know, I've been talking to people and ask them, like, what do you think about fairness doctrine going away? Should some of that stuff be brought back? And generally the answer is absolutely not. It's terrible for society. But I'm like, how do you get this back in the box? How do you start unwinding this disaster?
And the thing with fairness doctrine also is that it might exist in a world where we still have the 3 networks and you're getting all of your news through broadcasts. But with the way that the people consume media now is mostly through news feeds, and I don't know there would be any way to implement that. You know, and even things like, at one point Facebook was talking about, and maybe they're doing it, was talking about doing some sort of fact checking along with Snopes. Snopes is actually partisan. You know, Snopes doesn't want to seem partisan, but if you like look into Snopes, if you look at what they write, it's a partisan organization. So if you have Snopes as your fact checker, you're still, people who disagree with Snopes or who have a different ideological bent are not going to trust your fact checkers.
Yeah. Have you seen Fourth Watch?
I haven't, no.
Steve Krakauer. And he's been at CNN. He's also been at Blaze, right? So he's been all over the map. And he just launched this, which is, you know, Watchdog, where he's kind of calling bullshit on both sides. You know, we'll see how that plays out over time. But like, it's not on people's radars, right?
Yeah, I haven't heard that. There's also some network. I don't know what it is, but I heard that there's some network that is now, like, their mission is to do just straight up fact-based news, like no opinion.
Oh, WGN.
Yeah, WGN. Yeah, I haven't seen it yet. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. And so where's the line between journalism and opinion and pure entertainment, right? Like, how, as a consumer, do you even know where to get news? And where, you know, when it's like, there's no disclaimer that's like, by the way, we're going to tell you what we think on this program.
Right. I mean, and sometimes there is, but so The Stranger, the paper that I worked for years, there was no line between news and opinion, and that was the model for the Alt Weekly. But now everybody is like that, right? So even if you're reading if you're reading a news piece in the New York Times, you're probably going to find some sort of moral lesson, the reporter's sort of morality lays through it, and maybe that's inevitable. I don't believe that humans actually can be objective, but so you can acknowledge that. You can say, okay, well, you can still have balance. You still have an obligation to present the opposing side. And I think NPR is the worst offender for this, personally. And maybe that has to do with time constraints or something like that. But I listen to NPR all the time, and they will have segment after segment where they have one guest who's making an argument, and they don't challenge the guest, and they don't bring anybody else to give an opposing opinion. And because people, I think, are wrongly under the impression that NPR is objective, some people, then they think, oh, this is just the truth. This is just the way.
So do you think people actually want objectivity, or are people in media just giving people what they want?
That's a good question. I mean, if you look at what pays the bills, I don't know about the New York Times sort of finances, but if you look at, top stories or whatever, you're probably, from most sites, you're probably going to find that the stories that most people read are the highly opinionated, controversial, sort of maddening hate reads, and less the piece about the school board meeting or whatever.
Yeah. So do you think regulation is appropriate in this environment? Where does
Well,
how do you make steps toward walking back some of the crazy?
I don't know that regulation is appropriate, in part because look at who the regulators are. Maybe in some sense, like, I think that, like, the FCC, if they're talking about things like, regulating mergers, like, that's appropriate, obviously. Like, we do not want Sinclair to own every local television station in America.
Mhm.
But should regulators be dictating what a private business does within their pages? I have a bigger problem with that. If the private business isn't getting some sort of government funding, I think if you accept government funding, there should be some sort of, maybe some strings attached. But if you're a private company, I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah, I'm just concerned about the reward cycle of, the if it bleeds, it leads, but like times a
Totally.
billion, right?
Yeah.
And, the more emotional, the more polarizing, the more accusatory, you're going to make more money. You're going to get
Sure.
more attention, right?
Yeah.
And there's no movement yet for like sustainable discourse.
Right.
It's actually going to be healthy, long-term, and constructive.
Right.
And so why would anyone choose it? As a consumer, why would you choose it when you can be told that you're right and that you're on the good team and the other team is bad?
Right. Yeah.
Why, as a media organization, would you try to bring objectivity to an issue? What is the incentive? What is the payoff for anybody to choose a healthier way of existing?
That's the question.
That's the question, right? I get that is the question. So, do you see, do you value America being united as a country in spite of our differences? Is that important?
I don't know what that really means.
Like, I'll give you an example. I was really disappointed with the pandemic because I thought for a minute, you see,
Right.
my office has a sign in the lobby that still says we're all in this together.
Totally. Yeah, we're not.
What a crazy thing to say in public right now.
I
Like,
know.
who thinks we're all in this
I know.
together, right?
People
And
keep saying it. It's not true.
there was a moment where we could have been. We
Yeah.
actually could. Why did we have to argue about an illness? Like,
Right. Well, it becomes a culture war thing, right? And there was a lot of discussion about this. Will COVID kill the culture wars? And obviously the answer is no. I mean, masks, like a preventative to get the thing that might prevent you from getting sick has become ammunition in the culture wars, which is totally inevitable. And I think part of that is just a reflection of our politics and who in particular is our president at this moment.
So if Biden wins, what is the reaction from conservative media? And if Trump wins, what is the reaction from the left?
I'm less concerned about there being some sort of like right-wing uprising if Biden wins, unless there is some kind of, like if Biden, this would never happen, but if like Biden won the Electoral College and lost the popular vote, there might be some sort of, popular uprising. I don't think that's going to happen because people thought the same thing was going to happen after Obama won, who is a much more polarizing figure than Biden is. So I'm not concerned about like, right-wing militias trying to take over the White House or anything like that. Mm-hmm. I am concerned about the reaction on the left if Trump wins. I think that everything we've seen over the past couple of years is just going to get worse and worse and worse. And I think it'll also, we have this narrative on the left right now that the United States is intractably racist, sexist, bigoted, that this is a terrible country. It's not actually reflected in most Americans' attitudes. Like if you look at polling, well, Americans actually, this is the most diverse country in the not just currently, but in the history of the human species. And if you look at racial attitudes, well, they've liberalized incredibly over recent decades. They're trending in the right direction, but Trump is a data point that people use to come to the opposite conclusions. They extrapolate from his victory, even though he didn't win the popular vote, that this country is racist, and the only reason that Donald Trump can be president is because this country is racist. And I think that's a really dangerous myth. And I also think that if he's elected, that myth will just grow. And I think that's really scary. I think the political violence that we're seeing right now is going to get much worse if Donald Trump wins.
I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but who actually decides who the winner is, perception-wise? Do you see a scenario where media outlets start calling it in different directions? I mean,
yeah.
Who settles this one?
I mean, this could come down to the Supreme Court. Who knows? I mean, oh shit. Okay. Is this being recorded?
We can pause.
Okay. My neighbor just okay, hang on a second.
So we're coming back online here, and we had a little interruption. Why did you get interrupted?
So I live across the street from this 86-year-old man, and he has a dog. His dog's name is Bruce, and my dog's name is Moose. And the dogs are best friends. So every morning.
Was this a coordinated effort, or did it just happen?
It just happened. Uh-huh. So he calls me about this time every day to send the dog over. So I just open the door and the dog runs over to his house. But I'm doing this, so I didn't answer the phone. So he came over. I probably took him 5 minutes to walk over here with his cane.
And does he live in your echo chamber with you?
He does not know what a podcast is. So I live with my wife. I'm married to a woman. And he makes the assumption that his politics are our politics. So I think he thinks that the lesbians across the street are Trump supporters, which is sort of funny because the neighbors on the other side, who I'm also friends with, they're sort of hyper woke SJW people who assume that my politics are their politics. So my neighbor on that side was telling me the other day, was talking to me about how J.K. Rowling is transphobic the other day. So my politics are nowhere or somewhere in between the two of them, but actually I have very little politically in common with them. But he's a lifetime NRA member. He has literally 200 guns in his house. He has a big Second Amendment sign on his door. And when we moved here, those symbols made me sort of scared of him. I didn't know anything about him except that the guy liked guns and he has a bunch of trucks and he's an old white man, a Navy vet. And so I had I had stereotyped him in my head. And I didn't want to get to know him. I had no interest. But my wife is a much better person than I am. And so she did. And it turns out that he's now, he's my main social contact. And he's very fun to talk to this person who I totally disagree with. And it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
We can still be friends.
The solution to everything, though, is your relationship with your next door neighbor, right?
Totally.
How do you
get
to
getting dogs?
And getting dogs, but how do you get to a place where you can live in harmony with a neighbor who has an entirely different life and set of beliefs that you do?
It just shouldn't be hard. I don't know. I mean, maybe this has something to do with my upbringing. My parents are super liberal. They're atheists, and I grew up in the South, in rural Appalachia. So I was used to being surrounded by people who were different than me. I was the only one in my class who hadn't been baptized as a kid. So I guess I kind of grew up that way, and so it doesn't seem difficult to me. And I don't know if I would have said this in my college in my 20s, but it just doesn't seem difficult to me to get along with people who don't believe the same things that I do.
Yeah. So I think it's actually, I think it's a powerful metaphor for everything we're talking about, right? Because we talk about what's the answer? Well, I think you actually just showed us what the answer is.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's such a lack of nuance, and I think we can all agree on that. Everything is sound bites and red jerseys and blue jerseys, right?
It really is. It's really sorry to interrupt you, but I was just thinking today about You know, what if we didn't have those? Like every time you read a news article and it's talking about someone in Congress, there's a little R or D beside that person's name. And
Mhm.
that tells you what you're supposed to think, you
Right.
know, just
Right.
the label. What if we didn't have that? And obviously, like, we're not going to get to a place where we don't have political parties, because political parties are the machine that makes everything run. But what if we didn't, you know? What if you just voted for people and you looked at their positions and you didn't pay attention to the labels?
So do you think that the political parties are getting more deeply entrenched?
Yes.
You do. They're getting more powerful rather than,
Well,
I thought after Trump, the Republican Party would disband.
right,
We'd see something else happen, right? How wrong was that? It seems
right.
like it's more so that way than ever.
I do think that that's true. The Republicans seem better able to rally around a figure for the good of the party than Democrats are.
Hmm.
I think if Biden loses, there's going to be a real fracturing within the Democratic Party between the sort of new progressive wing, the Squad, the AOCs, the Bernies, and the old guard.
Yeah. So around this issue of nuance, you are an individual who is representing a much larger group of people in this country who are dealing in nuance and accepting it and engaging it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the forget what we're receiving, is that the exception to the rule in terms of demand, or do you think there is actually a lot more demand for that type of discourse than what we're being served?
Oh, I think there's a huge demand. You can just look at the success of, you know, even a polarizing figure like Andrew Sullivan. Some people would argue that nuance isn't his thing, but Andrew, you know, he was basically fired from New York Magazine.
Mhm.
He's now making something like $700,000 a year on his newsletter, on a weekly newsletter, right? Joe Rogan, you know,
He's doing fine.
he's $126 million. Is that what he got from Spotify?
I know it's 1 to 2. You got better numbers than I do on that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
he did good.
Yeah. So I think there's a huge market for the conversations that Jesse, my co-host, and I are having on our podcast. Yasha Monk started a newsletter, Persuasion, that I'm not sure what the numbers are, but seems to be doing really, really well. And he's having these sort of conversations as well.
But these are all kind of startups and
Mm-hmm.
independent groups, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what would make the mainstream media folks, like, I don't even know how to define mainstream anymore, right?
Right.
But the legacy groups, the bigger organizations, what would get them to listen? Is it ratings changes? Is it a consolidated voice from the brands that sponsor them? What would get
Yeah.
your attention?
Well, the thing is, I mean, there should be a really strong firewall between editorial and marketing and the money people. So ideally, no. Ideally, brands should not be able to influence coverage of anything. You know, ideally, you can advertise or not, but you don't get to have a say in what, and the bent of the news organization.
Can we park there for a
Sure.
second?
Yeah.
So I think that probably works in terms of like journalistic integrity if that were actually like a standard, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, when all of these brands are, nobody can sponsor Tucker Carlson,
Mm-hmm.
or risk, chaos on their
Right.
business.
Right.
Does that make that all pointless? All of the brands that are trying to choose what they sponsor because they don't want to actually influence the content.
Right. Well,
So,
Tucker is still one of the most popular cable shows in America. So
right.
even if brands don't want to touch them, people are still watching.
But they can't make money for the business.
That's true. I mean,
So is their voice, so I hear what you're saying, that in theory they should not be able to influence,
right.
But in reality, like you said, like all the walls are down,
Right.
separating
Right.
opinion from news.
Right.
And so I wonder if that's the only path, but it's an interesting perspective. I had not considered it that way.
Yeah.
Brands did try to take a stand and say, look, we'd like you to adhere to some journalistic standards.
Right.
That might actually be undermining the entire principle that they're
right.
advocating
Right.
for.
I mean, as a reporter, like at The Stranger, I'm sure there were times when something I wrote or something somebody else wrote that we lost advertisers because of it. If it happened, I rarely heard about it.
Uh-huh.
We just didn't, we were on different floors. We didn't have those discussions, which I think is really how it should be, because from a journalist perspective, you don't want that to influence your coverage. And that's not something I never thought about, how advertisers were going to respond to my content. If you're an independent creator, it's a little bit different. Like Jesse and I now are talking to ad people now. And that's one of our concerns about dealing with ads, is if we have ads, is that going to somehow influence what we do? And the money would be going to us directly, which is very different than it being filtered through a paycheck through an organization. You have to think about it more.
Yeah. I want to play the unsolicited advice game with you. Before we do that, I need to ask for a little bit of help from our audience. And just very quickly, we're talking about separation and connection, right? And there's a cause that my wife and I are a part of that we actually launched, called the Koala Corps. And it sets out to solve the problem of children in children's hospitals, young children that are not independent and able to care for themselves between when they're receiving medical support. And there's nobody there to hold them because parents can't be there all the time. There's a great need in this country and probably internationally for people that can come in and just hold babies. Because you have sick kids crying in a bed and nobody to take care of them, because the caretakers, the physicians, the nurses, they're very busy at doing their job. They can't just be holding babies all day. So what we launched was something called the Koala Corps, which doesn't touch any money. All donations go directly to Children's Hospital, specifically to fund a program so that children at the most vulnerable stage of life, in the most vulnerable position, can get the love and support and comfort that they need. If that's something that you are in a position to help with, please go to koalacorps.com. That's KOALACORPS.com, and give what you can. It's a very important issue. If you like what we're doing here, please make sure you subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. And also visit oxfordroad.com to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer, which gives you industry updates and thought leadership around the advertising business. Okay, let's get back to our conversation with Katie. Katie, this is very important because a bunch of people that are not going to listen to this show or watch this show, we're going to give them very important advice, or you
Excellent.
are.
All right.
We're going to do it in the tweet size. We figured out the length of a maximum tweet takes about 20 seconds to read out loud. So you get 20 seconds to say something to all of these different people.
All right.
Ready?
Sure.
Okay, first one is Donald Trump. Ready, set, go.
Wait, I'm just supposed to give him some advice?
20 seconds of advice for Donald Trump.
Oh my God. Donald Trump, turn off the television. Go for a walk. Go outside. Go play some golf if you need to. Just turn off the TV. That's all you need to do. Yes.
You think if you turn off the TV, turn off the Twitter?
Oh, hopefully. Maybe just put your phone down. Put the remote down. Put the phone down.
Yeah. Well, he needs some quiet time.
Yes, he does need some quiet
time. Joe Biden.
Maybe turn on the TV. Joe Biden my advice to Joe Biden is to show up. Where are you, Joe? Show up, go talk to people. And obviously he's doing something that he has done something that I think he needs to do more, which is strongly condemn political violence on both sides, because the right will use what's happening against him. So he needs to come out very strongly against that.
100%. Marketers.
Send better emails. If you're trying to get someone to write about your products, send better emails. Try to be fast. Offer people who can be on the phone immediately if you have a compelling story. And also get used to the fact that 90% of the time your email will just get thrown right away into get thrown in the trash box right away. So accept failure.
Love it. Okay. Members of the media.
Get off of Twitter. That would be number one. Go out into the world and talk to real people who don't believe everything that you believe. Get out of New York, get out of DC, get out of San Francisco, and start a podcast. Quit your job, go independent.
We need more podcasts. You can't be the only one. I know.
Yeah, I know. Someone should join me.
Okay, Republicans.
Oh my gosh, Republicans. Dump Mitch McConnell. That would be number one advice. Dump Mitch McConnell. Learn to update your moral code. Realize why you are out of touch with the American populace. Realize why young people are leaving in droves, because you aren't cool. So if you want to not die off with the next generation, it's time to update your sort of cultural war stuff. Less about abortion, less about gay people, all that.
Gotcha. Okay, Democrats.
As with Joe Biden, Democrats need to unequivocally condemn all political violence, especially when it comes from the left. And also, Democrats need to somehow reconcile the two different wings of the party, or figure out how to live together and get along. And I don't know. Start winning. Play dirty if you have to. Republicans will.
Okay, and American citizens. Last one.
Talk to your neighbors. Go on road trips and talk to the people that you meet.
Even also, the NRA members?
Yes, especially them. Okay. Especially them. Talk to people who don't believe the same things that you do. Talk to your racist uncle. Realize that you cannot shame people into changing their beliefs. And if you want people to change their beliefs, you have to come from a place of love and kindness, because that's the only thing that works.
I wish everyone in America would actually hear you say that. I really do wish that. That's touching. Okay, bonus question is, if you could write in one person and they would automatically be the next president, they have to be alive.
Oh,
other than that, anybody you want, who would you pick?
Oh, that's so hard. Yeah. Al Franken.
Really?
Yeah, Al Franken.
Isn't he canceled?
He's dead. Oh yeah, he's gone. He's gone. But if we could, I mean, if you read Jane Mayer's reporting on Al Franken in the New Yorker, and it becomes pretty clear that he got railroaded. There was a lot of like dirty politics. He got rat fucked pretty much. Yeah, Al Franken.
Do you think that? So you think he's done though? There's no coming back for him.
Not anytime soon. Like things could change.
Like starting to get back out there.
Yeah, different crowd though. Right.
I don't even want to equate what they're.
Right. Well, I mean, just different. O'Reilly, I think, has a different. He's appealing to an audience that cares less about things like sexual harassment.
So the left will just not have him back.
Not right now.
Got it. Who's doing the most harm in media?
Oh man, that's a good question. Twitter. I mean, journalists are doing the most harm. Journalists are ruining their own reputations. It would be easy to say Fox News, but
if the individual contributors.
Well, actually, let me change that. I think the biggest harm in media right now is market forces. There's so many local papers. Like as great as it has been for me to make a living, basically spewing my opinion about things. If I could press a button and the media would go back to how it was in the 80s and 90s, when every town had a local paper, and sometimes a local daily paper, and there were reporters covering things like the city council and the school board, I would do it, because that's important. The things that are not getting covered are really, really important. But there's no prestige in them. And there's also, you don't have a pipeline of like young reporters who are going through and becoming beat reporters for years. That just doesn't exist anymore. Online has changed all of that. And, if you want to be a writer, you go work at some place like Vice or BuzzFeed or whatever, which is, BuzzFeed does some good news stuff, but it's mostly opinion writing. And opinion writing makes things worse. I say as an opinion writer.
Right. Interesting. Did you read Ezra Klein's Why We're Polarized?
I have not read that, no.
Really good. And, one of the things he points out that we don't really like to talk about is like, how much influence are we really going to have as individuals on this election, right? And it's all anybody talks about. And, I live in California. What difference does it make, right? But
doesn't.
Local politics,
right?
You could actually sit down with somebody who's making a decision and they might listen to you, right? And nobody cares about local.
No.
Is my perception. And why is that the case? And is anything happening to encourage participation in a way that can actually make an impact? We're so mad about things we can't affect.
That's a really great question. I think voter turnout in local elections is probably even lower than it is in national elections, which is sort of pathetically low in this country in the first place. And you have in cities that's different, like the Seattle City Council. People do care about the Seattle City Council. But in the small town where I live, I could not tell you the names of the members of the city council in my own town, and I am politically engaged. I've interviewed the mayor, and I still couldn't tell you who's on the city council. I know one person on the city council.
There is no like online platform to engage in your local politics.
Yeah.
Or local politicians, is there?
Not that I'm aware of.
How crazy is that?
Yeah, and local politicians have a much bigger impact on how we live our lives than national ones usually.
Wow. Okay. Any other thoughts about journalism and what it will take to change? I know we keep coming back to this, and there aren't great solutions, but just any solutions you can imagine.
I think we're in a really interesting moment right now. I think you're going to see the power of the old guard sort of collapse in a lot of ways as it becomes less and less relevant to people's lives, and as it reflects the way people really believe. That said, then you have things like the New York Times 1619 project possibly being taught in schools or banned from being taught in schools if Donald Trump has his way. But I think things are going to fracture even more. We have these, since the development of online media, and since Facebook and Google have scooped up all the ad revenue, so many organizations and publications have just collapsed. They just don't exist anymore. But that doesn't mean the media disappears. It means that, people support independent creators like myself. And I think that's what the direction is going to be. People choosing who they like and supporting who they like and ignoring everybody else. And there's some real consequences to that. Although some people will make a shit ton of money, but for society as a whole, I think there are some real consequences to that.
Yeah. Katie, this has been awesome. I'm for some reason I'm like touched by this conversation just because
That's terrible.
No, it's true, because I feel like you have such an authenticity and are willing to take a position. Like, I can't put you in a box, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody puts everybody in boxes, and like, you won't be put in a box. Mm-hmm. And that's really, really rare. It's really, really precious. And I feel like it's what the world needs right now. And so thank you for everything that you're doing. Can you get some plugs in so people can find out how they can engage with you?
Sure. My podcast is called Blocked and Reported. It's available on every major podcast platform. We're on Patreon at patreon.com/blockedandreported. I'm on Twitter at Kitty Herzog. That's pretty much it. That's where I live online these days.
All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
And, this show is dedicated to the notion of e pluribus unum, out of the many one. And we believe that we can work through the differences that we have and the deepening divides in this country, and we value welcoming perspectives that are different from our own. So thank you for joining us as we go on the long journey to national recovery and sustainable discourse. If you found this helpful, please subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. And don't forget to visit oxfordroad.com and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. I want to give a special thanks to Bianca, Kyle, Jennifer, and the whole team at WIT for making it happen. We have a republic. Let's try to keep it.